The dead man's eyes were looking at the wrong wall. That was the first thing Jedediah Stone noticed. Not the blood, which was absent. Not the scream frozen on Marco's face. A perfect O of silent terror. It was the eyes. They were wide and staring, but they weren't aimed at the ceiling or the floor, or at Jed himself. They were pointed directly at the solid durasteel wall to his left, as if it were the most fascinating thing in the universe. The second thing Jed noticed was the smell. It wasn't the coppery tang of death or the foul stench of a ruptured organ. It smelled like ozone and burnt sugar, a sickeningly sweet and electric scent that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Jed was a maintenance technician on the Ark, -9, the Stargazer. His job was grease and wires, humming conduits, and the occasional coolant leak. He was not a detective, but Marco was his friend. They'd shared lukewarm coffee from the dispenser in Sector Gamma for the last 10 years of the endless voyage. Marco was supposed to be fixing a busted atmospheric regulator in this service tunnel. A simple job. Now, he was sprawled on the grimy floor grid, his body stiff. The official report, when it came down from the overseers an hour later, would say, massive electrical discharge. A freak accident, a 1 in a billion surge from a frayed power line. Case closed. But Jed had seen the power lines. They were pristine. He had run his diagnostic tool over the entire junction. Nothing. Not a single stray volt. And an electrical discharge wouldn't make a man's eyes stare at a wall. It wouldn't leave behind that burnt sugar smell. And it wouldn't do what had been done to the tunnel itself. It was subtle, something only a man who spent his life in these metal guts would see. The wall Marco was staring at. It was warped. Not dented. Not buckled from heat. It was warped on a level that made Jed's stomach turn. The lines of the rivets, which should have been perfectly straight, seemed to curve inward for a few feet around where Marco's gaze was fixed. They flowed like soft plastic around an invisible point, and then straightened out again. It was geometrically impossible. A trick of the light, Jed told himself. A stress headache from the recycled air, but he knew it wasn't. He knelt, his worn boots sticking to something unseen on the floor. He didn't want to touch Marco, but he had to know. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his friend's shoulder. The body was cold. Not just cold, but a deep, absolute cold that seemed to suck the warmth right out of Jed's fingers. It felt like touching a piece of the void between stars. He snatched his hand back, a yelp catching in his throat. This wasn't death. This was an absence. He stood up, backing away slowly. The silence in the tunnel was immense. The usual hum of the ship's life support seemed distant, muted. All he could hear was the frantic thumping of his own heart. He looked at Marco's face one last time. The terror etched there wasn't from a sudden jolt of electricity. It was the look of a man who had seen something that should not exist. Jed turned and ran. He ran from the impossible curve in the wall, from the burnt sugar smell, and from the cold, cold body of his friend. He didn't know it yet, but he was running from a secret the size of the galaxy. A secret that had followed humanity from the ruins of Earth, hiding in the dark heart of their very salvation. The Arks were not just carrying the last of mankind. They were carrying its tomb. The medbay was sterile and white, a sharp contrast to the grimy tunnels. Jed called his office. Dr. Aris Thorne looked older than his 50 years. His face a roadmap of fatigue, carved by the dim lights and recycled air of the Stargazer. He peered at Jed over his spectacles, his expression a mixture of professional concern and deep-seated weariness. He had been the one to pronounce Marco dead. He had signed the official report. "It was an electrical surge, Jed," Aris said, his voice soft but firm. He swirled the amber liquid in the glass he held. "Real Terran whiskey, a relic from a time before the Exodus. A currency of its own in the upper decks. A tragic, unfortunate accident." "No," Jed said, shaking his head. He had come here straight from the tunnel, bypassing his own quarters. He needed someone to believe him. "No, it wasn't. There was no surge. I checked. The whole grid was clean. And the wall, Eris, you saw the wall." Eris sighed, taking a slow sip of his drink. He looked away, toward the panoramic screen that served as his window. It showed the star-dusted blackness of space, unchanging, eternal. A beautiful, terrifying wallpaper for their cage. "I saw a minor structural stress point. The ship is 200 years old, Jed. It's bound to have quirks." It wasn't a quirk. It was wrong. It was like something had pushed on reality and left a dent. And Marco, he was so cold. Colder than he should have been. "Jedediah," Aris said, using his full name. Something he only did when he was trying to be stern. "Grief can play tricks on the mind. Marco was your friend. You are looking for a reason, something to blame. But sometimes, T here is just a faulty wire and bad luck." Jed slammed his hand on the metal desk, making the doctor's instruments rattle. He was scared of something. For the last week, he was jumpy. He kept talking about his new assignment. Core Storage 7. Said there were strange energy readings. Said the overseers were watching the sector like hawks. He was supposed to tell me about it after his shift. The mention of Core Storage 7 made Aris freeze. Just for a second. A flicker in his eyes, a tightening of the muscles in his jaw. It was almost imperceptible, but Jed saw it. He knew the ship's guts, and he knew people. Aris was hiding something. "Core Storage 7 is a restricted area," Aris said, his voice suddenly flat, all traces of warmth gone. "It holds sensitive archival materials. Historical data. Nothing a maintenance tech would need to worry about." "Marco was worried," Jed insisted. "He said the hum was wrong." Every soul on the Ark was born and raised with the hum. The constant, low-frequency vibration of the engines, the life support, the gravity plating. It was the ship's heartbeat. You only noticed it when it changed. "I think you should go to your quarters, Jed," Aris said, standing up. The conversation was over. "Get some sleep. We can talk more tomorrow." Jed stood his ground. "You saw his body, Aris. You are a doctor. You tell me, does a man die from an electrical shock and leave no burns? Does his body become a block of absolute zero? Do it make the air smell like burnt sugar?" Aris stared at him, his face a mask of careful neutrality. But his hand, the one holding the glass, was trembling slightly. The whiskey sloshed against the crystal. "The report is filed," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Overseer Rostova personally reviewed and signed off on it." The name hung in the air like a guillotine. Overseer Eva Rostova, the head of the ship's council. A woman whose smile was as cold as the vacuum outside. Her word was law. To question her was to question the entire structure of their society, the very mission of survival. It was not just insubordination, it was heresy. Jed understood. Aris was afraid. Whatever had killed Marco was tied to the overseers, to Core Storage 7. And Aris knew it was better to be a living doctor who signed a false report than a dead one who asked too many questions. "Fine," Jed said, turning to leave. "I'll go get some sleep. He walked out of the med bay, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. But he wasn't going to his quarters. He was going to the service archives. Marco had mentioned strange energy readings. If there were official logs, even restricted ones, Jed knew how to find them. He was a maintenance technician. He had back doors to back doors. The overseers might run the ship, but men like him kept it from falling apart. And he was about to start pulling on a thread that could unravel everything. Core Storage 7 wasn't like the other storage bays. They were cavernous spaces, packed to the ceiling with crates of nutrient paste, spare parts, and hydroponics equipment. This one was different. After an hour of slicing through firewalls and rerouting access codes in a dusty terminal, Jed had managed to get the schematics. The bay was almost entirely empty. A massive, hollow sphere in the heart of the ship's 7th sector. At its center was a single object, designated only as the artifact. There were no descriptions, no manifests, just a label and a web of energy warnings that made Jed's skin crawl even looking at them on a screen. Getting there was another matter. The direct route was guarded by 2 security checkpoints. No chance. But Jed knew the ship's veins. He pulled up a map of a ventilation system. There was a shaft 9 Beta, that ran directly over the storage bay. It was an old decommissioned duct, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. It was perfect. The journey through the shaft was hellish. It was tight and dark, the metal slick with a century of condensation. The only sound was his own grunting and the scraping of his tools against the walls. After 20 minutes of inching forward on his belly, he felt a change. The air grew colder, and the hum started. It wasn't the ship's familiar, comforting drone. This was a deeper, discordant sound that vibrated not in his ears, but in the bones of his skull. It made his teeth ache. It was the wrong hum Marco had talked about. Below him, he found the grate Marco must have used. It was loose. Jed pulled his laser cutter from his belt and sliced the corroded bolts. The metal panel fell away with a soft thud onto the floor below. He peered down. He was suspended 30 feet above the floor of Core Storage 7. The sight stole the breath from his lungs. The room was just as the schematic had shown, a vast, dark sphere. In the absolute center, floating in a cage of crackling blue energy, was the artifact. It was not what he expected. It was not an alien machine, or a crystal, or anything solid. It was a smudge, a patch of wrongness. It was a sphere, maybe 10 feet in diameter, of pure, absolute black. It didn't reflect the blue light of the containment field. It consumed it. It was not a shadow. A shadow is a lack of light. This was a lack of everything. It was a hole in the universe. The hum was coming from the containment field, the sound of unimaginable power straining to hold that patch of nothing in place. Jed felt a wave of nausea. A splitting headache began to bloom behind his eyes. The burnt sugar smell was here, thick and cloying. He realized with a jolt of terror that this was what had killed Marco. He must have been looking down from this very grate when something went wrong. A flicker in the field, a pulse from the nothingness. As he stared, hypnotized by the sheer wrongness of the thing, he felt a pressure in his mind. It wasn't a sound, but a thought that wasn't his own. A whisper made of cold and silence. Where? The word echoed in the empty spaces of his brain. It was a question filled with a yearning so vast and ancient, it felt like a physical weight. Jed's nose began to bleed. A warm trickle ran over his lip. He wiped it away, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He felt a profound, instinctual urge to answer the question, to tell the whispering void that he didn't know. He didn't know where they were. He had to get out. This place was poison. He started to pull himself back away from the grate, but he paused. He saw something on the floor near where his grate cover had fallen. A data slate? Marco's data slate. He must have dropped it. Jed knew he should leave it. He knew he should crawl back the way he came and forget everything he had seen. But Marco had died for this. Jed couldn't let it be for nothing. He unhooked a magnetic retrieval line from his belt. It was a risky shot. He lowered the line, his arm trembling from the strain and the mental pressure. After 3 tries, the magnetic head clamped onto the slate. He reeled it in, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had the slate, he had to go, but he risked one last look down at the floating hole in reality. As he watched, he could have sworn he saw it shift. It wasn't a movement. It was more like a blink, a moment of deeper, more profound blackness. And the whisper came again, not a word this time, but an image. A flash of 1 billion stars dying at once. A vision of a galaxy turning to grey dust. A klaxon blared to life, shattering the silence. Red lights began to strobe through the bay. His unauthorized entry. They had found him. He scrambled backward into the shaft, pulling himself through the suffocating darkness with a desperate, panicked strength. He didn't know what he had seen. Not really. But he knew one thing for sure. Humanity hadn't just fled a dying Earth. They had brought the plague with them. The steel door to the interrogation room slid shut with a sound like a tomb ceiling. The room was small, grey and featureless, except for the table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. Jed sat in one, his hands cuffed in front of him. Across from him sat Overseer Eva Rostova. She wasn't wearing the ceremonial robes of her office, just a simple black uniform that made her look severe and dangerous. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her high cheekbones. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky. "Jedediah Stone," she said. Her voice was calm, but it had an edge like broken glass. "Technician, 3rd class, a model citizen for 10 years. So you can imagine my surprise when your name flags a dozen security alerts in a restricted sector." Jed said nothing. His head still throbbed from the hum in Core 7, and the metallic taste of blood was still in his mouth. Marco's data slate was hidden in a loose panel in his quarters. It was his only card to play. "You were a friend of Marco Gallo," Rostova continued, her eyes boring into him. She wasn't asking a question. "He died in a tragic accident. My condolences." The words were hollow, a script she had memorized. "It wasn't an accident," Jed said, his voice raspy. A faint, cold smile touched Rostova's lips. "Ah, yes, the grief-stricken friend with his conspiracy theories. Dr. Thorne warned me you might be unstable." So Eris had sold him out. Jed felt a bitter sting of betrayal, but he couldn't blame the man. Fear was a powerful motivator. "I was in the ventilation shaft above Core Storage 7, Jed confessed. "There was no point in denying it. I saw it. The thing in the containment field." Rostova's expression didn't change, but a new stillness came over her. The air in the room grew heavy. "You saw an experimental energy core, part of the Genesis project. It is the future of this ship, Mr. Stone. The power source that will allow us to finally settle a new world." "It's not a power source," Jed shot back. "It's a weapon. Or something worse. It's what killed Marco." "Marco Gallo died because he was careless," Rostova said, leaning forward slightly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "He got too close to the containment field during a diagnostic, The energy discharge was instantaneous. His body was compromised by the radiation. That's why it seemed unusual. That is the official and final explanation. It was a lie. A clean, well-constructed lie that explained away all the weirdness. But Jed had been there. He had felt the silent, questioning whisper in his own mind. "What is it?" Jed asked, his voice low. "Really, what are you hiding in there?" Rostova leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Let me tell you a story, Mr. Stone. 200 years ago, our ancestors fled a dying planet. We were the last of our kind, packed into these metal shells and flung into the darkness, hoping for a miracle. For generations, we have drifted. We have sacrificed. We have maintained a delicate order to ensure our survival. That order depends on one thing: faith. Faith in the mission. Faith in the leadership that guides it." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "That faith is fragile. It can be shattered by fear, by rumor, by a maintenance man who sees something he does not understand and starts asking questions. The work being done in Core 7 is beyond your comprehension. It is vital to our survival. And it is secret for a reason. To protect the population from a panic they cannot afford." "Protect them from the truth," Jed countered. "The truth is a luxury we don't have," Rostova said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "What you saw is dangerous, yes. All great power is. But it is our only hope. And I will not have that hope jeopardized by one curious man." She stood up. "You will be confined to your quarters. Your access will be restricted to your immediate work sector. You will not speak of this to anyone. You will forget what you saw. You will go back to fixing pipes and cleaning filters. If you do this, you will live out your life in peace. If you do not," she let the threat hang in the air, "then you will find that accidents can happen to anyone, not just your friends." 2 guards entered the room and pulled Jed to his feet. As they led him out, Rostova spoke one last time, her voice like a chip of ice. "The Ark is a delicate ecosystem, Mr. Stone. And I am a very dedicated gardener. I will prune any branch that threatens the health of the tree." Back in his cramped quarters, the silence was suffocating. Jed was a prisoner in his own home. He knew Rostova was watching him. He was a loose end, and she would tie him up one way or another. He popped the loose panel by his bunk and pulled out Marco's data slate. His hands were shaking. This was his only chance. He had to know what Marco had found. He plugged it into his personal terminal, bypassing the ship-wide network. The screen flickered to life. It was a mess of corrupted files and energy logs, but one file was still intact, a personal audio log. Marco's voice filled the small room, and Jed felt a fresh wave of grief. Log entry: "I don't know the date. I can't think straight." Marco's voice was a strained whisper, filled with static and terror. "The hum, it gets inside your head. It shows you things. I saw it happen. I saw Earth." There was a choked sob. It wasn't war. It wasn't a plague. It was erased like a bad drawing. One minute it was there, the next just quiet. The thing in the core, it's not our salvation. It's what we're running from. A burst of static, then his voice again, clearer, terrified. "The containment is weakening. I can see the numbers. It's growing. Oh God, it's growing." The log ended. Jed stared at the screen, the blood draining from his face. It all crashed into place. The impossible warp in the tunnel wall, the absolute cold, the whispers. Humanity wasn't fleeing a disaster. They were the disaster. They were carrying the apocalypse in a box, and the box was starting to break. Sleep offered no escape. It was a gateway. The moment Jed closed his eyes, the nightmares began. They weren't the usual stress dreams of failing systems or angry supervisors. These were different. They were visions, delivered with a clarity that felt more real than his waking life. He stood on the surface of a world with a sky of burning crimson. The ground beneath his feet was glass, and he could see the faces of the dead trapped within it, their mouths open in silent screams. A silent wind blew dust that was not dust, but the pulverized remains of cities and mountains. In the center of the sky was not a sun, but a perfect circle of black. The unraveling. It pulsed, and with each pulse, another continent turned to gray ash and blew away on the silent wind. He woke up gasping, his bunk sheets soaked in sweat. The hum of the ship was still there, but now he could feel the other hum beneath it. The dissonant, hungry vibration from Core 7. It was a bass note of wrongness that resonated in his teeth and bones. He was confined to his quarters, but the thing didn't need a door to get to him. It had found a way into his head. The days blurred into a paranoid haze. He was allowed out for his work shifts, but always with a security guard. A silent shadow trailing 10 feet behind him. His co-workers avoided his gaze. The story was out. Jed's stone had cracked. Grief-induced psychosis. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. He was contaminated. He tried to act normal. He replaced a faulty pump in the water reclamation unit. He calibrated a series of nutrient dispensers. But all the while the whispers were there, at the edge of his hearing. Faint, inquisitive. What is this place? What is metal? What is warm? It was learning. The thought was so terrifying it made him drop his wrench with a loud clang. The guard took a step closer. Jed picked up the wrench, his hands slick with sweat. He had to get a message to Aris. The doctor was afraid, yes, but he was also a man of science. He had seen Marco's body. The lie must be eating at him. Jed found his chance in the mess hall. Aris was there, eating alone, pushing grey nutrient paste around his plate. Jed's guard stood by the door. Jed walked over to the waste disposal unit, right next to Aris's table. As he scraped his own plate clean, he spoke without looking at the doctor, his voice a low mumble. "It knows, Aris. It's learning, it's in my head." Aris didn't look up. He kept his eyes on his plate. "Go away, Jed, you are being watched." Marco left a log. Jed pressed on, his back to the guard. He saw it happen to Earth. We didn't escape the disaster. We brought it with us. The containment field is failing. Aris's fork stopped moving. He sat perfectly still. For a long moment, the only sound was the clatter of trays and the low murmur of conversation in the hall. "My quarters," Aris said, his voice so low Jed could barely hear it. "Tonight, after third shift, the west airlock maintenance panel. It's faulty. It needs a technician." It was a risk, a huge risk for both of them, but Aris had given him an opening. The hope that bloomed in Jed's chest was a fragile thing, but it was better than the cold dread that had been his constant companion. That night the nightmares were worse. He was floating in the void of space, untethered. He saw the Stargazer and the other 8 arcs, a tiny fleet of refugee ships sailing through the infinite black. But they weren't just moving forward. They were leaving a trail, not of light or energy, but of decay. Behind them, the stars were going out. One by one, a trail of darkness stretching back across the galaxy. The unraveling wasn't just on the ship. The ship was the focal point, the seed of a much larger decay. It was a cancer, and the arcs were its metastasis. He saw Overseer Rostova standing on the bridge. Her eyes were not human. They were black, empty circles, just like the thing in the core. She was smiling as the universe died behind her. He woke with a scream caught in his throat. He was shaking so violently his bunk rattled. The whisper in his head was louder now, more confident. Soon. He looked at the clock. It was time. He put on his jumpsuit, his hands trembling. The guard was gone from his door, a small mercy. He made his way through the sleeping corridors of the ship, every shadow looking like a threat. He reached the west airlock. The panel was open, as Aris had said. He slipped inside the maintenance crawl space. A moment later, a shape appeared in the darkness. It was Aris. "You are a fool for coming," the doctor hissed. "You came too," Jed replied. "I saw the full autopsy report," Aris said, his voice shaking. "The one Rostova buried. Marco's cellular structure. It wasn't damaged, it was gone. In places, his cells had just ceased to exist. There were microscopic holes in his tissue, not holes in the physical sense. Holes in reality. I am a doctor, Jed. I can't unsee that." Jed pulled out Marco's data slate. "Listen to this." He played the audio log. Marco's terrified voice filled the cramped space. When it was over, Aris was pale, his face slick with sweat. "My God," he whispered. "Erased." "It's growing," Jed said. "I can feel it. It's getting stronger. Rostova knows. I think she wants it to." Aris stared into the darkness, his mind reeling. "This is beyond us, Jed. We're a technician and a doctor. What can we do?" "There has to be someone else," Jed insisted. "Someone who knew. The people who built this thing. The original engineers of the Ark." Aris shook his head. "They're all gone. Dead. Or," he trailed off. "Or what?" Jed pressed. "Or recalibrated." Aris said, the word tasting like poison. That's the official term. For citizens who suffer extreme psychological trauma, a threat to the social order they are, helped. Their memories are wiped. They're given new, simpler lives on the lower decks. They're vegetables, Jed. Empty shells. Jed's heart sank. A dead end, but then a flicker of an idea. Is there a list of the recalibrated? "Yes, in the medical archives," Aris said, confused. "Why?" "What was the name of the chief engineer of the Genesis project?" Jed asked, his mind racing.
"The one Rostova said was in charge."
Aris's eyes went wide with dawning horror and understanding. Vance. Elias Vance. The lower decks were a different world. The corridors were narrower, the lights dimmer, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and nutrient paste. This was where the ship's underclass lived, the menial workers, the forgotten. It was also where the recalibrated were housed, in a quiet supervised sector called the Tranquility Ward. Getting in was Aris's job. He flashed his medical credentials at the board orderly, saying he was there for a routine checkup on a patient. The orderly waved them through without a second glance. The common room of the Tranquility Ward was a deeply sad place. People sat in worn-out chairs, staring at blank walls or at the flickering images on a communal screen. Their faces were slack, their eyes empty. They were bodies without pilots. "It's monstrous," Jed whispered, looking at the hollowed-out people. "It's Rostova's version of mercy," Aris replied grimly. "They can't cause trouble if they can't remember their own names." They found Elias Vance sitting by himself in a corner, meticulously stacking small gray food cubes into a perfect pyramid. He was an old man with wild white hair and eyes that were a pale, washed-out blue. He didn't look up as they approached. He was completely lost in his task. "Mr. Vance," Aris said softly. The man didn't respond. He placed another cube on his pyramid. Aris knelt beside him. "Elias, my name is Dr. Thorne. We need your help." Nothing. The man was gone. Jed felt a crushing wave of disappointment. This was a fool's errand. They were too late. But Aris had come prepared. He pulled the medical syringe from his bag. It was filled with a clear liquid. "This is a neural stimulant. Highly illegal," he said quietly. "It's designed to counteract deep sedative drugs. I have no idea if it will work against the recalibration process. It could kill him, or it could do nothing." "Do it," Jed said. There was no other choice. Aris hesitated for a fraction of a second, then quickly and expertly injected the drug into Vance's arm. For a moment, nothing happened. Vance continued to stack his cubes. Then his hand began to tremble. He dropped a cube. He looked at his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. A flicker of something entered his pale eyes. A light in a long darkened house. He looked up at Jed and Aris, and for the first time, there was focus in his gaze. Confusion, then fear. Who are you?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle from disuse. "We're friends," Jed said quickly, keeping his voice calm. "We need to know about the artifact. In Core 7, what is it?" Vance flinched at the words. His eyes darted around the room, as if expecting Rostova's guards to appear. The fog was clearing. Memory was flooding back, and it was agonizing. "It's not an artifact," he whispered, his hands clutching his head. "We called it that to sanitize it, to make it sound manageable." He started rocking back and forth. "Its real name. We called it the Unraveling." "The Unraveling," Jed repeated. The name felt cold and sharp. "It's not from our universe," Vance said, his words coming faster now, a torrent of buried truth. "It's a point, a single dimensionless point, where the laws of physics are." Wrong. "It's a fundamental flaw in the fabric of existence. A cosmic typo." He looked at Jed, his eyes filled with a terrible ancient dread. "It doesn't destroy things, you understand. That's not the horror of it. Destruction implies debris, remnants. It unmakes things. It deletes them from causality. It removes them from ever having been." The blood drained from Jed's face. He thought of Marco's body, the holes in his cells. He thought of the vision of Earth, erased. "Earth," Jed started. "We've found it," Vance choked out, tears welling in his eyes. "A research team in a deep space observatory. They detected it. A tiny fluctuation. We thought it was a new form of energy. We brought a sample back, a single contained particle. We were fools." He let out a dry, rattling laugh that was half a sob. "We put a drop of acid in the middle of a photograph, and we were surprised when it started to eat a hole in the picture. The Unraveling on Earth. It started to grow, slowly at first. A lab disappeared. Then a city block. Then the city block. Then, though it's too late, the evacuation, the Arcoid wasn't a rescue mission. It was a quarantine." "You brought a piece of it with you," Aris said, his voice a horrified whisper. "On this ship." "On all the arcs," Vance corrected him, his body shaking. "It was the only way. A desperate, insane gamble. Project Genesis. The idea was to anchor the main Unraveling on Earth by creating smaller, contained instances of it far away, to spread its trace, its hunger, to slow the main expansion. We hoped to study it, learn to stop it. We were buying time. You brought the end of the world onto a refugee ship, Jed said, aghast. We brought a chance, Vance shot back, a flash of his old fire in his eyes. The alternative was to let it consume everything, starting with our solar system and moving outwards. This way we had a chance. But the containment, it requires enormous power. It was never meant to last for 200 years. It must be failing. The neural stimulant was wearing off. The light in Vance's eyes began to fade. The fog was rolling back in. Rostova, he mumbled, his focus wavering. She was my junior, my protege. She saw it differently, not as a problem to be solved, but a power to be wielded, a weapon. His eyes went vacant again. He looked down at the fallen food cube, his brow furrowed in confusion. He picked it up and carefully placed it back on the pyramid. Elias Vance was gone. Jed and Aris backed away slowly, leaving the old engineer to his meaningless task. They walked out of the tranquility ward, their minds reeling from the terrible truth. The hum of the ship no longer sounded like life support. It sounded like a countdown, a clock ticking toward the final silent erasure of everything. The secret was out, and it was worse than they could have ever imagined. Humanity was not the victim of the apocalypse. It was the carrier. The truth settled in Jed's gut like a block of lead, the unraveling, a hole in the universe. They were nursing the very thing that had consumed their world, hoping it wouldn't notice the bars of its cage were rusting through. And Rostova wasn't trying to fix the cage. She was trying to teach the monster to bite. A weapon, Jed said, pacing the tiny confines of Aris's medbay. They had returned there, the only place on the ship that felt remotely secure. What does that even mean? How do you aim non-existence at someone? You don't, Aris said, staring at a diagnostic screen, showing the ship's energy distribution. He had pulled up a restricted file, one so deeply buried it took him an hour to access. You just are. Let it go. Point the ship at a star, a planet. Deactivate the containment field. The unraveling would be released. It would anchor to the nearest gravity well and begin its work. A silent, untraceable act of cosmic vandalism. She wants to use it, Jed breathed. The sheer nihilism of the idea making him sick. All this talk about a new home, a new beginning for humanity. It's all a lie. She's not looking for a home, she's looking for a target. Look at this, Aris said, pointing to the screen. A schematic of the containment field in Core 7 was displayed, overlaid with fluctuating power readings. Vance was right. The field is degrading. The energy consumption has been rising exponentially for the last 5 years. It's taking more and more power just to maintain its integrity. It's growing, Jed said, remembering Marco's final terrified words. It's not just growing, Jed, it's adapting, Aris replied, his face grim. It's learning how to push against the field. These spikes here, they're not random. They correspond with the FTL jumps. Every time we jump to a new system, the stress on the field is immense. It's like shaking a bottle of nitroglycerin. The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying speed. The ship was a bomb. Rostova was a madwoman with her finger on the trigger. And the rest of humanity, the thousands of souls in the cramped corridors of the Stargazer, were just along for the ride, dreaming of green fields and blue skies while they carried their own extinction. So, what do we do? Jed asked. feeling a familiar helplessness creep in. We can't go to the council. Rostova controls them. We can't tell the public. It would cause a panic that would tear the ship apart. We can't let it continue, Eris stated, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. The fear was still there, but it had been burned away by the terrible clarity of their situation. If Rostova gets what she wants, she won't just doom our target. She'll doom us, releasing that thing. Even for a moment is a gamble no sane person would take. It could latch onto the ship itself. It could unravel us all. Jed thought of the whispers in his mind, the cold, inquisitive presence. It was already inside the ship, inside him. Tea here is only one option, Jed said, the words tasting like ash. We have to destroy it. Aris looked at him. How, Jed? How do you destroy a hole? You can't shoot it. You can't blow it up. It would just unmake the explosion. Jed's mind, the mind of a maintenance man, a plumber of the spaceways, started working. He didn't think in terms of grand strategy, but of systems, of power conduits and plasma relays and engine cores. You can't fill a hole, Jed thought aloud. But maybe you can collapse it. What's the most powerful force on this ship? The single most violent, reality-bending thing we have? Aris's eyes widened. The FTL drive. Exactly, Jed said. The faster-than-light drive works by creating a temporary controlled singularity. A micro-black hole that tears a tunnel through space-time. We ride the edge of that tunnel to cross light years in an instant. You are talking about initiating a jump. Inside the ship, Aris said, horrified. Without the navigational shields, without the structural integrity fields, it would be instantaneous suicide. The singularity would form and immediately collapse, taking the entire ship with it. It would take the unraveling with it, Jed finished. Crush it into a point of infinite density. A proper black hole. Not a hole in the universe, but a hole of the universe. It might be the only thing that can contain it. Fight physics with physics. It was a suicide mission, a plan born of absolute desperation. To save the galaxy, they would have to erase themselves from it. A final, silent sacrifice. We'd need to get to the engine room, Jed said, his mind already tracing the path through service tunnels and access shafts. And we'd need to overload the drive core, manually. The engine room is the most secure part of the ship, next to the bridge in Core 7, Aris countered. Rostova will have guards everywhere. We can't do it alone. Then we need help, Jed said. He thought of his co-workers, the grease monkeys and pipe jockeys he'd shared his life with. Men and women who knew the ship's secrets, its quirks, its weaknesses. People who trusted each other more than they trusted the overseers. There are others who are tired of the lies, Aris. People who knew Marco. People who feel the hum is wrong, even if they can't explain why. You want to start a mutiny, Aris said, shaking his head. I want to save the galaxy, Jed corrected him. And I'll do it by breaking a few pipes if I have to. The plan was insane. It was a whisper against a hurricane. But for the first time since he'd found Marco's body, Jed didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a technician with a job to do. The biggest and last repair job of his life. He was going to fix the hole in the universe. The revolution started not with a bang, but with a whispered conversation in a greasy maintenance bay. Jed gathered the few people he knew he could trust. There was Lena, the tough, no-nonsense head of the life support team, a woman who could patch a hull breach with her eyes closed. There was old Sal, the comms expert, who had been quietly bypassing overseer censorship for years. feeding unfiltered news from the other arcs to his friends. And a handful of others, techs and engineers from the lower decks, who were tired of being treated like cogs in a machine they didn't understand. Jed laid it all out, the unraveling. Vance's confession, Rostova's plan, the suicide mission to collapse the FTL drive. He expected disbelief, scorn, fear. He got a grim, determined silence. These were people who lived with the ship's reality every day. They knew the hum was wrong. They knew the official reports were lies. Jed's story, as insane as it was, fit the broken pieces they had all been collecting. "She wants to weaponize it," Lena said, her knuckles white as she gripped a hydro spanner. "That woman would burn down the house just to watch the fire." The other arc, Sal added, his face pale. "They must be facing the same thing. The containment fields on their ships must be failing too." The thought was chilling. 9 ships, 9 ticking time bombs, scattered across the galaxy. 9 chances for the unraveling to break free. Their personal apocalypse was a franchise. "Our mission is here," Jed said, his voice steady. "On the Stargazer. We have to take out our piece of the puzzle. It's the only thing we can do." The plan was set. It would be a 3-pronged attack. Sal would use his backdoors into the comm system to create a series of fake emergencies, drawing security forces to the opposite end of the ship. Lena and her team would sabotage the secondary power conduits, knocking out lights and internal sensors in the engineering sector. That would give Jed and Aris the window they needed to make a run for the engine room. The night of the operation, the ship felt tense, like a string pulled taut. Jed felt the whisper in his head more strongly than ever. It wasn't asking questions anymore. It was making statements. A series of images, of feelings, hunger, impatience, a desire to be free. The unraveling knew they were planning something, or maybe it was just Rostova's paranoia that he was feeling. At this point, it was hard to tell them apart. Jed and Aris stood in a dark junction, waiting. "I am a doctor," Aris whispered, clutching a bag of medical supplies. "I took an oath to do no harm." "You are not doing harm," Jed replied, checking the charge on his plasma cutter. "You are performing surgery on the whole galaxy." The ship's lights flickered and died, plunging their corridor into darkness. Emergency lighting. A dim red glow kicked in. That was Lena's signal. A moment later, Sal's voice, digitally altered and filled with panic, crackled over the ship-wide comms. "Hull breach in Sector Beta. Repeat, hull breach. All security to Beta deck." "Let's go," Jed said. They ran. Through darkened corridors and service tunnels, their footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. The ship felt like a ghost of itself. They reached the main access corridor to engineering and found it blocked. 2 guards, armed with pulse rifles, stood their ground. They hadn't fallen for the diversion. Before Jed could react, a figure emerged from a side passage. It was Lena, her face smeared with grease, a heavy industrial welding torch in her hands. "Get to the engine room," she yelled, and fired the torch. A blindingly bright jet of superheated plasma erupted, forcing the guards to shield their eyes and fall back. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it was enough. Jed and Aris sprinted past, the heat of the plasma washing over them. They slid through the blast door, just as it began to close. They were in. The engine room was a cathedral of power. The FTL drive core dominated the center of the chamber, a massive, glowing sphere of contained energy, surrounded by a spiderweb of conduits and control consoles. The air hummed with unimaginable force. "Okay, Doc," Jed said, breathing heavily. Stay here and keep a lookout. I need to get to the primary ignition console. He ran toward the main console, his boots clanging on the metal walkway. But as he reached it, a voice stopped him cold. I knew you were more than just a simple mechanic, Mr. Stone. Overseer Rostova stepped out from behind the drive core. She was not alone. 2 elite guards in black armor flanked her, their rifles aimed directly at Jed's chest. It's over, Rostova said, a triumphant gleam in her cold eyes. Did you really think a handful of grease monkeys could outsmart me? I've been planning this for 50 years. Ever since I first understood what the unraveling truly was. You are insane, Aris shouted from the doorway. Am I? Rostova countered, a chillingly sane smile on her face. Humanity is weak. We're a pestilence, crawling on a speck of dust, thinking we matter. But with this power, we can become gods. We can silence the noisy parts of the universe. Create a perfect, quiet garden for a new, stronger humanity to grow in. A humanity led by me. As she spoke, the ship groaned, a deep, wrenching sound that came from its very bones. The lights flickered violently. On the wall monitors, red alerts began to flash. Containment filters. Imminent. The hum in Jed's head became a roar. The unraveling was breaking free. He could feel its cold, ecstatic joy. The walls of the engine room seemed to waver, the edges blurring. A fine gray dust, like the dust from his nightmares, began to drift down from the ceiling. Rostova laughed, a high, unhinged sound. It's too late. It's waking up. It wants to be free. The floor beneath them buckled. One of Rostova's guards cried out as the section of walkway he was standing on simply vanished. He didn't fall. He just ceased to be there. The other guard stared in horror, then opened fire on Jed. Jed dove behind a console as pulse rifle blasts stitched the air where he'd been standing. This was it, the final, desperate moment. He looked at the ignition console, then at the drive core. He couldn't reach the console in time, but maybe he didn't have to. The core was a contained star, and every star had fuel lines. He saw it, a thick armored plasma conduit running directly from the main reactor into the FTL core. It was a long shot. His plasma cutter was a tool, not a weapon, but it was all he had. While Aris drew the second guard's fire with a desperate volley of thrown medical tools, Jed scrambled under the walkway. He crawled along a maintenance pipe, directly beneath the roaring FTL core. The heat was immense. The reality warping effects were stronger here. The pipe he was clinging to seemed to stretch and shrink with every breath. He reached the conduit. It was shielded, but the access junction was right in front of him. He aimed his cutter. He had one shot. If he cut the line, the FTL core would be flooded with raw, unrefined plasma from the ship's main reactor. It would go critical in seconds. He could hear Rostova screaming orders. He could hear the crackle of pulse rifles and Aris's pained cry. The gray dust was falling thicker now, coating everything in a film of nothingness. He felt the cold whisper of the unraveling caress. His mind one last time. It offered him power. It offered him a quiet universe. Gee, it whispered. Go to hell, Jed grunted, and pulled the trigger on his cutter. The beam of pure energy sliced through the conduit's armor plating. There was a blinding flash of white light, a soundless roar that was felt rather than heard. The FTL core, force-fed a torrent of raw power it was never meant to handle, began to scream. Its steady glow turned into a furious, unstable vortex of light and shadow. Jed was thrown from the pipe as the entire engine room convulsed. He hit the deck hard, the air knocked from his lungs. He looked up, his vision swimming. Overseer Rostova stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and fury, as she watched her dreams of godhood collapse into a man-made star. The guards were gone, erased by a flicker of the failing containment. The unraveling was free, a growing sphere of absolute black in the center of the room. But the collapsing FTL drive was faster. A singularity was born. It did not explode, it imploded. Gravity, sudden and absolute, seized the engine room. The light, the sound, the very air was dragged into the newborn black hole. Jed felt a terrible crushing weight, as if the entire universe was sitting on his chest. He saw the sphere of the unraveling, that patch of cosmic wrongness, get pulled, distorted, and stretched into a long, thin scream of nothing, as it was devoured by the singularity. It was like watching a drain suck down the last of the bathwater. He saw Aris, slumped against the doorway, give him a weak final nod. He saw Rostova raise a fist in futile rage before she was turned into a stream of atoms and pulled into the abyss. Jed's last thought was not of heroism or sacrifice. It was of Marco and the lukewarm coffee they used to share. It was of a green field he had only ever seen in pictures. It was a simple human thought in the face of cosmic annihilation. From the outside, the event was silent and brief. The refugee ship Stargazer shone with an impossible, momentary brightness. Then, in a fold of space-time, it collapsed in, on itself, vanishing from existence. It did not leave wreckage or debris. It left only a scar. A new, tiny black hole, a point of honest natural gravity, where a moment before there had been a ship carrying a lie. Across the galaxy, on the 8 other arcs, 8 other containment fields continued to strain. 8 other time bombs continued to tick. But one had been diffused. One seed of the unraveling was gone. The galaxy was vast, and largely unaware that it had been saved, in part, by a maintenance man with a plasma cutter. There was no monument, no record. There was only a new quiet star in the dark, a tombstone for the ship that had carried humanity's last hope and its greatest secret. The silence that followed was absolute.